everyone, welcome to the 4th Halal in Travel Asia Summit. This time, we are meeting under slightly different circumstances, but we are glad to be able to bring you Halal in Travel at ITB Asia once again this year. My name is Rauda, and I lead strategic partnerships and projects at Crescent Rating and Halal Trip. And today, we have a very exciting program lined up for you. First up is a peek into our Mastercard Crescent Rating Travel Readiness Report released in July this year. Up next will be a panel session with Nagesh Jaladi from Mastercard, Barkathunisha Abu Bakar from Elevated Consultancy, and Fazal Bahardin from Crescent Rating and Halal Trip, who will be moderating the session. This is followed by key highlights from our dialogue with key tourism stakeholders on how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected their destination and travel as a whole. Now, Fazal Bahardin, CEO of Crescent Rating and Halal Trip, will share key insights into the Mastercard Crescent Rating Travel Readiness Report, which aims to help all stakeholders better frame the impact of COVID-19 on our industry and subsequently help build scenarios for travel.
Thanks, Rhoda. So as Rhoda was saying, so we're going to focus today on the Mastercard Crescent Rating Travel Readiness Report that we released recently. So let's get started. In 2019, we were looking at a completely different picture of how the travel was going to evolve globally. Here I have looked at how ASEAN was looking at travel and tourism. The projection was that by 2022, the travel and tourism will be contributing more than $500 billion to the GDPs of the ASEAN destinations. There was almost 1 million jobs created every year during the last few years, and also was projected to continue on that path. We were looking at the Muslim market, as we mentioned in our 2019 Global Muslim Travel Index. We were looking at 160 million Muslim travelers globally in 2020, and we were also projecting that by 2026 that this market will grow to 230 million travelers. However, this has of course now dramatically changed. The COVID has completely changed the way that we have been looking at the market growth. 2020, 160 million is definitely not going to happen in the Muslim market, and more importantly also by 2026 we had projected 230 million, and this will now be a question mark as well. We'll probably do some projections sometime later in the year as things get a bit more clearer and a bit more stabilized. I think we'll be able to project some new numbers on how this market is going to grow. Looking back in 2019, again, our main concerns were over tourism, sustainable tourism, overcrowding, how do we increase yield? And then all of that has now changed. We are now faced with the unprecedented challenge of this COVID-19. We are coming to terms with lockdowns and all that, and most importantly for the travel industry, as we look forward, we have a different set of concerns to look at. How do we rebuild visitor confidence? How do we rebuild trust? The competition will be fierce, so these are, and how do we safeguard health? So I think we have a different set of concerns to look at as we go forward. The issue, I think the real issue of course also, is that there are more unknowns than knowns as we look at the industry now, the future of the industry as we see it now. So that's the context of our report, the Travel Readiness Report. Generally our reports have been data driven and consumer survey driven reports. However, this report, because there are so much of unknowns out there, so we looked at the report slightly differently. So this report developed, in this report we developed frameworks, models, tools, so that we can then start building scenarios, because as I said, there are a lot of unknowns out there. So only way to sort of navigate this scenario is to build different scenarios and see how we are going to manage those different scenarios. So that's the focus of this report. And in order to help us to understand these frameworks and tools and models and develop scenarios, we have used ASEAN travel and tourism numbers so that we can understand the applications of that. But these tools and frameworks are easy to use, so that any destination or any business could use these tools to start developing your strategic plans, as input to your strategic plans at least, and also build scenarios so that you can start understanding how things will work out in the future. So let's get started. So the whole report is really based on this travel readiness framework, where we are looked at 4 areas. One is drivers, the travel readiness drivers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then we are looked at the different phases of this travel opening up. So one is travel opening up phases, and we also looked at the recovery phases, and this is mainly driven by the COVID situation. And based on these drivers and phases, we have built some scenarios, which we call here paths. And then based on that, we have looked at recommendations, or here we have called it injectors, in terms of preparing for the next phase of travel. So I'm going to briefly talk about all these 4 aspects of the report. Let me start with the drivers. So drivers, we were looking at 3 areas. One is the health management, the travel economy itself, and consumer behavior, because these are interlinked, but they have a huge bearing on how ready the travel will be or as we open up. In terms of the health management, the report doesn't look much deeper into that, because that's not the focus of the report. So the report mainly focuses on the travel economy numbers and consumer behavior surveys that we have done together with MasterCard. So in terms of the travel economy, it's good to understand, and as I said, we are looking at ASEAN numbers to understand the use of these models and tools. So we are looked at ASEAN demographics, one of the youngest populations in the world, and median age of 31 years. More than 65% of them are under the age of below the age of 40 years. So I think this is something that is good for ASEAN, because as we see number of reports that we are beginning to see indicate that the younger population will be the first ones to travel, so older populations will be reluctant to travel, at least in the beginning. So I think this is something that ASEAN destinations could explore much further. How do you get younger travelers to travel, of course, with all the safeguards in place. When you look at the domestic intra-ASEAN inbound ASEAN markets in 2018, the market was worth about $300 billion, the total ASEAN travel market, and a huge portion of that was domestic market, which is why we see that there is a concerted effort among all ASEAN countries now to revitalize the domestic tourism market. And of course, I think this will have to continue, because that's the only possible market, at least at the moment. However, I think the next market to look at will be intra-ASEAN. That represented almost 18% of the total ASEAN travel market. And of course, then there was about 35% of inbound ASEAN market, and this will take a bit more time to get traction, especially because these are medium to short haul markets to ASEAN, medium to long haul markets, and that will, as we see, mostly the short haul markets will be the first one to get initial traction. That's the overall market. If you look at the Muslim market, so Muslim market, ASEAN Muslim market was worth close to about $60 billion, dominated by the domestic markets, but also very important, the intra-ASEAN market. The intra-ASEAN market, almost 40% of ASEAN, Muslim ASEAN market, around 40% was intra-ASEAN market. So I think that's a key aspect to look at, as and of course ASEAN is very Muslim friendly. Most of the ASEAN destinations are very Muslim friendly, so I think intra-ASEAN market will be a market to look at as we get through this pandemic. So that was on the travel economy a bit. We have gone into a little bit more detail in the report. Let's briefly also look at the consumer behavior and sentiments. So the report looks at these consumer behavior or sentiments across the ASEAN destinations like Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Philippines, because you need, with those sentiments, you will be able to understand better whether what are the impediments for promoting domestic tourism and intra-ASEAN tourism. Also, the report looks at some of the consumer behaviors of the top inbound countries to ASEAN, or inbound markets to ASEAN, which is mainland China, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Australia. In terms of the behavior and sentiment itself, so we have looked at the impact on household income. We have looked at behavior changes in shopping, behavior changes in dining, behavior changes in entertainment. Of course, travel itself. Of course, this is a moving target, so we will continue to watch this behavioral changes. So in the report, as I said, we are looking at these aspects of consumer behavior, which of course will continue to change. So that's about the drivers. So then we looked at the phases, and as I said, we looked at two types of phases. One is the phases of travel opening up. Here we see four levels of travel opening up. One, of course, is domestic, which I think almost all ASEAN countries have opened up now. Then we are looking at travel bubbles and travel corridors, or green lanes as some call it, which we already begin to see that some ASEAN countries within ASEAN or outside of ASEAN are developing some kind of corridors like that. And then the third phase is a really intra-ASEAN fully opening up, which I think will be key to really boosting the take-up of travel within ASEAN. And then eventually the international travel, which will take some time to open up, but these are, as we see currently, the four phases of travel opening up. And this probably is the most important slide here. So we have also identified four phases, recovery phases: containment phase, recovery, normalization, and growth. And most of the countries in the world were in containment phase, and we see that some of these countries have now moved on to the recovery phase, especially most of the countries in ASEAN region, where the services are gradually opening up, domestic travel is beginning to get started, and hopefully we will all be able to move to the normalization phase, where with some good news about COVID cure, COVID vaccination, then we could go on to intra-ASEAN travel, and then eventually, the new normal of growth. What this new normal is, of course, still a question mark, but we'll get into this new normal at some point in time. Having said that, it's not a smooth sailing from one phase to another. We have seen, especially between containment and recovery, we have seen that some countries who move to recovery phase have to go back to containment, at least partially in different regions within the country. So I think we'll have this going back and forth, hopefully not too many times before we start moving to normalization, which COVID cure will be crucial to get to that stage. Luckily that I think especially in ASEAN, most countries have been very careful, so we are more in the recovery phase and probably stable in the recovery phase in many of the ASEAN countries. So that's about the drivers, that's about the phases. Now let's look at the parts. So based on these drivers and phases, what we did was we developed some scenarios, potential scenarios of growth. So we looked at the market size, the travel readiness drivers, as I said, health, economy, and behavior. We looked at the domestic opening up of the markets, domestic, intra-regional, and international. And based on, and also looking at that, recovery phases of containment, recovery, normalization, and growth. So then we built these three growth paths. However, this was done sometime as we released the report, end of July. So this was done in July. So we had this positive scenario, growth scenario, where we will reach 94% by middle of 2021, and a plausible scenario at that time, 71% recovery up to 71% of 2019 levels by 2022, and the pessimistic scenario of just getting to about 31% of what 2019 travels were by the end of 2022. Having said that, the positive scenario, as we saw then, is no more possible. The positive scenario today probably is closer to the plausible scenario than what is plotted here as positive scenario. So I think plausible scenario is still a possibility, and that will mainly depend on the vaccine and things like that. And however, having said that, some of the discussions we have had, and some experts are saying that pessimistic scenario is also a realistic scenario. So having said that, this is a moving target, so we need to keep a close eye on these scenarios and continue to fine tune them, so that the businesses, both whichever part of the industry that you are in, will be better equipped to manage the fallouts or the positives or the negatives of these scenarios. So that's what it is. So we will from Crescent Rating and MasterCard, we are planning also to see how we can update these scenarios as we go along, so that it gives a better idea for the stakeholders. So that's drivers, phases, and paths. So finally, the report looks at what we call injectors here. So these are basically recommendations based on these things that I just discussed. So in order to do that, we have used our ACES framework that we use in our Global Muslim Travel Index. And based on that, so we have looked at what are the access gaps, what are the communication gaps, what are the environment gaps, what are the services gaps, what are the traveler strains based on these gaps, what are the destination strains based on these gaps, and what could destinations and travel service providers could do in order to overcome these strains and constraints. So this is it doesn't have all the answers to all the problems that we are facing today, but it gives a framework for you to develop more such, identify more such pain points and develop recommendation. This is one set of recommendations, but you can use this methodology to identify more pain points and see how you could overcome these pain points. And here we have also sort of highlighted which injectors or recommendations are relevant for which types of organizations, whether it's governments, NTOs, operators, developers, or even locals, or even tourists themselves. So as I said in the beginning, this report is more about models and tools and scenarios than giving you exact answers to all the challenges we are facing today. That brings me to the last section of my presentation, which is again to highlight that the ASEAN is a pretty big Muslim travel market, and there are four main things to look at when it comes to ASEAN. Muslim represent almost 43% of the intra-ASEAN travelers. Median age of Muslims is only 29 years. They represent 21% of the domestic travel market, and most importantly, ASEAN is a very Muslim friendly region. We have Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, and even and Thailand, of course, very Muslim friendly, and even destinations like Philippines who have done a lot to make travel easier for Muslims. And then even other markets have been trying to do to encourage Muslims to come to the destinations and trying to provide the necessary services and facilities for the Muslim market. So I think Muslim market is going to be one of the key markets to enable both domestic and intra-ASEAN travel in the region. So that's about the report. So you can download the report at crescentrating.com, and please feel free to give your feedback once you had a look at the report. And thank you very much, and hand it over to Rauda.
Thank you, Fazal. As Fazal shared, the problem is complex, and what the report aims to do is to help you customize recovery paths using the framework, models, and tools developed in the report. There really is a need for deeper understanding to better prepare the travel segment not just for post-COVID, but the need for destinations to come together to avert another COVID-19-like scenario. Next, we have a panel session with Nagesh Jaladi, Retail and Commerce Lead Asia Pacific at Mastercard, as well as Barkathunisha, founder of Elevated Consultancy and an academic at Murdoch University, Singapore. Fazal Bahardin, CEO of Crescent Rating and Halal Trip, will be moderating the session. Our speakers will discuss some of the concerns and challenges faced by the travel industry as they develop return to growth paths.
Thank you, Nisha and Nagesh, for joining me today. So, it's a pleasure to have you both. Before we start, discussing some of the areas that we wanted to cover today, maybe Nisha, if you can, briefly introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you, Fazal. I'm a tourism practitioner. I've been around for more than 2 decades now in the tourism industry. But I'm also a consultant that provides management and business consulting services for the tourism and hospitality industry for destination marketing. As an academic, I'm also been teaching in the higher education and been publishing on tourism marketing, halal tourism with Crescent Rating, and now more inclined towards women in tourism development. And the latest initiative is that I'm working on one of the very important SDG goals is on the empowerment of women in the tourism industry.
Thanks, Nisha. Nagesh, maybe a brief introduction yourself as well.
Sure, Fazal. Thanks for having me. Nagesh Jaladi, I'm from Mastercard. I focus on our merchant relationships and business development for Asia Pacific. Clearly, a lot of that has historically been driven by tourism, travel. Probably our biggest partnerships in the region are clients from those sectors. And more broadly, you have always come from an analytical background, and in the current new world, focusing on working with a lot of merchants to continue to adapt and react to how the market conditions are, and especially going back to what Anisha was saying, how do you prepare for a potential recovery and how do you go forward from here? So excited about sharing the perspectives and hearing from all of you as well.
Thanks, Nagesh. Thanks. I mean, staying on you, you just touched upon a subject that I wanted to, recovery. I mean, everybody's talking about recovery. When does the recovery come? You have, Mastercard has done a number of surveys, which was included in our reports as well. Tell us some of the, key indicators for recovery that you have sort of, gathered from your surveys and insights.
Yep. So first thing I will start with, do not have a magic wand. I'll tell you what we're seeing from the markets, and obviously a lot of it is driven by government and regulatory situations that you're seeing in place. So there are markets that are further ahead than others, where I think things have gotten better. You're starting to see some of the corridors starting to open up, things of that nature. Couple of big takeaways as we keep talking to different customers through our surveys, as well as when you overlay their actual behavior in terms of how you see consumer spend tracking across. There's some very clear trends that definitely come up. Health is obvious. Health and safety continues to be the same. So let's establish that as the baseline, and I don't think that is very different across markets. What you are also starting to see is confidence in their own economies being a big factor that drives their consumer spending behavior. And that also has to do with the fact that there is a lot of pent-up travel demand. Most people have been stuck indoors or within their own markets. So there's definitely a lot of pent-up demand. However, you also see a significant concern across different groups on their ability to weather the current situation and come out stronger from an economical perspective. So if you were to ask us, how do you look at some of those trends coming back up, it really goes hand in hand. Where you have economies that where their consumers are feeling strong that the economy is going to come back soon and we have a high degree of confidence, you'll see more of that happen, maybe on a more accelerated scale. But for some of the others, it's going to be a bit of a longer ramp up to what could have been business as usual before.
Thanks, Nagesh. So that's from a, let's say, from an economic perspective. I mean, from a behavioral perspective, Nisha, we had this discussion earlier as well. Before the COVID, we were talking about changes in terms of behavior, in terms of like what you call the responsible tourism, sustainable tourism, which is your passion as well. How do you see that playing a role as we recover, tourism?
Okay. So what is happening, I feel, is there's something very interesting. The new direction that is happening post-COVID, during COVID, I'm sorry, is that tourism has gone to a halt. And a lot of, whether it was practitioners or academics, are talking about the fact that maybe the slow tourism is not really a bad thing. It's a time for us to really recalibrate where we want to do tourism, in the direction, which direction we should be going. And UN's vision for tourism is that sustainability should be the new norm. Sustainability should be the new norm. And so there is a lot of discussions right now as to how we could bring sustainability, or today, some of us are pushing it forward, not just sustainability, but regenerative forms of tourism, regenerate tourism to something better than what it used to be before. What you notice is on two sides, supply side and the demand side. From the demand side, we are noticing travelers are now appreciating the way that we have moved away from over-tourism. There was a lot of debates on over-tourism at one time, and some of the travelers were very, very uncomfortable with that form of tourism. So on the demand side, there are tourists who are appreciating the physical distance or the quietness, where we are sighting really beautiful things in the environment at the moment. And there's an appreciation for the sustainability of the environment. On the supply side, there are, from what I'm noticing, there are tour operators and organizations that are beginning to come up with products which would cater to a high-end travelers who would appreciate not small cutthroat profit margins, but customized, localized, authentic experiences to more sustainable destinations. So I'm quite heartened by the fact that there are tour operators that are re-evaluating how they should run their business models. So there's some very good positive trends that are happening from the supply side and the demand side to move our agenda towards sustainability in our tourism industry.
Nagesh, do you, I mean, of course, may not be directly related, but do you see some of these things coming through any of your surveys that, you know, are the new traveler going to be more concerned about the environment, concerned about sustainability, responsibilities? Is there anything along those lines that you have sort of seen?
No, great point, and especially as you know, coming from a rather lull, as you've seen across the world. In that case, there's been a lot of focus on this coming back up. However, with the markets that we're starting to see, to Nisha's point, where there are trends that we're observing, is there's a lot more focus on what the destination has to offer. So obviously the basic levels of health, safety, what are the precautions that are in place. There's a lot more focus on experiences. And Nisha really touched on that very well. On the supply side, there is a clear indication that you are looking for a very specific type of experience. And again, you could also look at it as micro experiences when you look at that more the course of a 2-day, 3-day, or a longer vacation. What are the different micro experiences that you can have over the course of that vacation? And there's definitely a lot more focus on that. Where we're also seeing some increasing trends, especially in the current scenario, a lot of the demand is still driven by which corridors are open. So to Nisha's point, I'd love to see, as things start ramping up more, where there is scope for travel and there are more open corridors, it'll be very interesting to see, would our more sustainable focused travel experiences driving more of the behavior, or is this still being driven by the fact that 90% of travel corridors are still shut down? That's really where some of the trends we're looking at is consistent. But bottom line, there's still a lot of interest in people who want to travel, and that's understandable.
Right.
True.
Yeah.
True.
I agree with Nagesh. You know, it's really interesting because one of the important things for the development of localized and authentic experiences is what the local or host population has to offer. You know, it's not about the tour operator designing what they think is right, but it has to come from the local stakeholders, the local community. And I think for a long time, our industry has not been giving priority to the locals, their local experiences, and what the local stakeholders have to offer, right? So there was a disconnect very often between the supply side and what the host community can offer, and the traveler was in between. But today, the agenda is moving towards looking at what can be done to consult the local community. How can they be a very important stakeholder to bring the social dimensions to tourism? Right? It's not just the physical dimension to tourism, but the experiences, the social dimensions are very important today because that's what the traveler wants. So if you're a tour operator or a hotelier, you can't do that if you do not understand what is the real local experience, what the local stakeholders can provide. If you can rote them as very important partners in your product delivery, I think you'll be able to bring that experience that today's consumers or tourists or travelers are seeking.
Thanks.
Nisha,
Go ahead.
One thing to add to what Nisha was saying, Fazal. It's very, very apt, and it's almost like you're having to innovate within the confines of travel restrictions that are in place. So obviously there's definitely more focus on what can we do regionally, which probably wasn't there. And as a traveler myself, I can attest to that. We're looking for what are the best experiences within the scope of what's available. The other interesting fact, if you look at it from a travel operator, a hotel side as well, they're now starting to focus on what can we do from a staycation perspective. As I talk to a lot of our travel clients, a big majority of them, given the current situation, are thinking about how do I differentiate experience? How do I come up with this wide variety of experiences that caters to different segments, including for families, maybe a vacation is also a significant piece. And how do I pull those different micro experiences together over the course of that day that I can interest them to step away from their home and come and experience with that. And you're seeing a lot more of that happening. And the good thing coming out of this, if you can look at it that way, is you probably won't go back to the level it was before. It might still be something more elevated when we go back to normal.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Yeah.
thanks, Nisha. Since I think it's pretty interesting. For the first time I heard this term from Nagesh, daycation. I haven't heard it before. So Nisha, I mean, slightly.
What is nice about this year's World Tourism Day is that there's a focus on tourism development in the rural areas, and I've spoken on this before, where tourism has always been concentrated in the hubs, in the tourism hubs. It's time that we think about moving tourism to the peripheral areas, and that's in line with what is happening at the moment. If you bring it to the peripheral areas, that's where it's less crowded. That's where it could be very experiential. That's where it could be very authentic. But also, tourism dollars and economic development rightfully should go to the peripheral areas and move beyond the tourism hubs. So I think it's a fantastic time at this moment for tourism operators or hoteliers to start exploring how they could funnel tourism and tourism dollars to the rural areas and the peripheral areas, because it might fit in really well with where the tourists want the experiences to be.
Yeah, thanks, Nisha. Last question to you. I think you have been pretty active in female empowerment or women empowerment area, especially in the tourism area. How will that have sort of help in reimagining tourism? As we go forward.
Okay, I think it has come to quite an important point where we are realizing, number one, our tourism industry is largely, a majority of our workforce is women. True. Right? That we have to recognize it. Number two, COVID has impacted women a lot more than men in our industry. True. So that's where the attention is. But we also, with Crescent Rating, we've also found that majority of the traveler today is also women. And if women are not traveling, they are decision makers, So there is a lot of research and trends pointing to the fact that attention has to be given to understand the psychology of women as travelers or women as entrepreneurs, but at the same time, what can be done to also take opportunity of the current crisis to empower and bring some form of equality, in this industry. So She in Tourism and the other one is World Women Tourism. Our focus is this: how can we bring resources to women in our industry to help in the trajectory, socioeconomic trajectory, by giving them access to resources, access to opportunities, access to research, access to market segments, so that slowly, we can move towards developing the economic and socioeconomic status of women in our industry. So that's our agenda. And it fits in really well with the UN's SDG goals.
Yeah. Thanks, Nisha. We wish you all the best with your program, and definitely looking forward to seeing that grow. Nagesh, the last question. Give us some thoughts, your personal thoughts, having seen all this, having heard all this. What will 2021 in travel look like?
I wish I could. Personally, I'm hopeful. I think a big chunk of the shock to the system this year has been there was no precedence. Like, there's absolutely no baseline. As I reflect back on all the conversations with travel partners, consumers, there's just no precedent. Nobody knew what's going to happen. What could the baseline look like? So in hindsight, I think now that all of us have come out wiser, a lot of it forced by the situation, I think we will be able to be in a much stronger position. I am looking at data points that we're gathering from markets that are open. If you look at some of the trends in countries here in Asia Pacific, which are probably further ahead on the recovery path than a lot of the other markets, you're starting to see consumer sentiment, consumer behavior come back to levels in some areas pre-COVID. And that to me gives me a lot of hope and excitement as we move into 2021.
Thank you, Nagesh. Thank you, Nisha. Thanks for your time, and let's keep going and hope everything gets better
Yeah, it's
soon.
nice
Thank
to see
you.
that Nakish has ended off with a very positive note. I'm very, very positive. I think we are seeing a lot of very innovative change makers coming. And I think COVID presents an absolutely amazing opportunity. Yes, whatever negative is happening, but I think 2021, we are going to see some brilliant ideas coming up in our industry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All the best. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, speakers, for the insightful discussion. Let us now hear from destinations and travel industry stakeholders themselves on how they are overcoming challenges to rebuild the travel industry, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Because as much as we want to attract people, it's about making sure we provide consumer confidence. And right now, the consumer confidence around travel is low. As much as we've been in lockdown and we are yearning to travel, that is one of the key factors is going to require you or me or someone else who wants to travel to take that first leap. And what we will see is it's like, and I shared it with my team the other day, was what COVID-19 has done has reset tourism, but it almost takes us back to the very inklings of where tourism started, where you ventured out of your door, you ventured into your neighborhood, you ventured around your city, then in your province or your region, then you would go nationally, internationally, and that's how your confidence would build.
We will have problems. If, for instance, we are reducing the number of flights, first thing. Second thing, if we are increasing the price of these flights, so in that case, we will not have the low-cost tourism that we used to have in the past, which was essential here in ASEAN, because you remember before the pandemic, you are taking AirAsia, you are taking Tiger Air, whatever, you are paying $50 and you are going to some place. Yep. I don't think that this will come back any soon.
I can't even explain that, Fazal. It just has happened. But remember, we're 7,300 plus islands. And then when the lockdown happened, there were thousands of tourists, both domestic and foreign, stranded in our islands. So we had to work through all of our 16 regional offices and have some sort of an account of where they are and where they're headed. So we had to work on immediate sweeper flights out of the regions to Manila so that they can fly out of Manila to their destinations.
Basically, we have embarked on public PR campaign. Okay. We are bringing in small groups of media, bloggers, social media individuals that has good following and engagement to visit some of these local tourist attractions. We have a team now in the East Coast, Kelantan and Terengganu, and as we speak, there's one going to this off the beaten track places in Selangor, and engagement with the private sector is online, is very much on like a weekly or bi-weekly basis. So we are keeping in touch with the people in the country and also outside the country.
Fazal, I think since COVID broke out at the start of the year, there's been a lot of analysis on impact. And the primary focus has really been on the economic cost of the pandemic, the impact to GDP, the impact to different industries, and the impact to jobs, for example. But honestly, if you want to look ahead in terms of the path to recovery, then we are going to need to look at how all those things and all that impact is translating to changes in the consumer sentiment in terms of how the pandemic has changed attitudes, how it's changed behaviors, the view of the future, right? And how this is continuing to change over time as we go through the different cycles of this pandemic.
I'm sure that the Thai tourism industry will not be the same anymore.
I was going to ask you, how do you think this will have a long-term impact on tourism?
Let me talk like this. We have the record around 1 year is average around 40 million
Yes.
I don't think the next 2 or 3 years we will be get back to that number, 40 million. And even we can do that, we don't want to, just don't want to do it.
Don't want it, yeah.
People now, we now start talking what is the appropriate number of the Thai tourism capacity.
Yeah.
We probably would be think about roughly idea. We probably think about the 25 to 30 million a year.
Okay.
But we will be aimed to the high yield market.
Yeah, high yield market. Yeah.
High yield market. So medical tourism is one.
Right.
The luxury market.
Yeah.
The Thai gastronomic food. Thailand. I think Thailand is one of the countries that can offer many kind of food for the international tourists.
Right.
So halal food is one of the key things that we like to promote as well.
And I think here, what I notice is that many of the governments are quickly jumping in to bail out, whether it is the airlines or the tourism suppliers. But I think in regenerative tourism, we need to look at bailing out the damaged environment or the cultural environment. We need to bail that out, and not bail out the perpetrators, who actually created this environment. I'm sorry, but I think it could hurt the cruise companies or whoever, but whoever has been guilty of the mistakes of mass tourism and ecological damage, I think we have to be really careful about who is it that we are bailing out under such conditions.
And in terms of, you mentioned, we did, tourism did mistakes. What do you give us some examples? Maybe some of the mistakes that, mistakes in the sense, of course, tourism is a huge contributor to GDP. So all countries try to increase tourism and all that. So it's understandable. So what sort of things that they probably should have done differently?
Well, I think in terms of tourism development, we should have been a little bit more mindful about the way in which we were doing massive forms of development. We were not careful or sensitive to the locals' living conditions. So these are just some of the things that resulted in the whole tourist phobia, over tourism conditions, the reactions of the local people in Italy towards the tourists. We had actually dug our own graves when it comes to tourism.
Indeed, COVID-19 is the greatest challenge our generation has faced. It has had a devastating impact on human lives and lifestyle. It has and will change the travel landscape. We in the travel industry have been some of the most affected. After months of challenges, we are beginning to see a glimmer of hope to restart tourism. Thank you, speakers, and thank you to all of you once again for your participation. We hope this webinar has provided you with some useful framework and recommendations you can benefit from. You may download the Travel Readiness Report and other industry reports alike by heading over to crescentrating.com and clicking on the Reports and Publications tab. If you would like to know more or have further clarifications, you may contact us directly at info@crescentrating.com. Thank you everyone and stay safe.